Sorry. Vandana, are you here with us?
Yes, I think she is.
Yes, she is here. She's here.
But like students, one can't be 100% sure if somebody's actually at the table at the computer.
Hi, sir.
Hi, Vandana.
I'm so happy to see you here and welcome to my college. And I mean, in a virtual sense. And I'm sorry, I was driving and I tried to, unmute myself and it took a while. And I was also trying to turn on the video, but I could not. So I'm blocked off. But anyways, I'm happy we can all see you and we're so looking forward to hearing from you.
Yes, you and Shashwata made a lovely pincer move and you tracked me into
Yes. And this is just the beginning, sir. We're not going to let you go very easily.
I know he's been tempting me as well, saying now the college is a Garden of Eden that I must visit.
Yes, he's been working a lot, doing up the college, the garden and everything. He's also got a nice. We discovered a rock. Apparently, they discovered a rock. So so it's become the Deshbandhu rock now. So you need to see all that.
So basically, I was translating Deshbandhu College.
Yes, of course.
In his own language.
The other meaning of translation I'm using.
Yeah. The way I use it very often. So.
Yes.
Completely allowed.
Acha. लाइव हो चुका हाँ वही लिंक मुझे भेजना है Principal sir, are you here with us?
Yes, but I'm very much.
Yeah. So we now start formally, shall we? Yeah. So all the viewers and listeners, welcome to the annual lecture of Deshbandhu College Department of English 2021. And in this auspicious occasion today, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all and have Professor G.J.V. Prasad, Gauri Shankar, said J, I do not know, Venkateshwara Prasad, fine, Professor of English. And he has been teaching in Jawaharlal Nehru University for more than 35 years. And I think most of the people, those who have come here, have been associated with you, influenced by you, and have looked up to you for guidance in literature, translation, post-colonial studies, and in life in general. So we are extremely thankful for agreeing to deliver this talk on translation, Indian literatures and Indian English with us. So I welcome you, sir. And now I formally request our principal, Dr. Rajiv Agarwal, to welcome you and say a few words. Over to Dr. Rajiv Agarwal.
Thank you, Shashwat. Dear friends, a very good afternoon and namaskar to you all. A warm welcome on behalf of the college fraternity.
Vandana, kindly mute yourself. The road sounds are coming in. Thank you.
It gives me great privilege to welcome you all for today's talk. Translation, Indian English and Indian Literature by Professor G.J.V. Prasad is the first annual literature initiated by Department of English. Annual lecture. Professor Prasad is an iconic name in the field of translation, Indian English literature, post-colonial literature, recognized globally for his significant contribution to the field. Professor Prasad is an award-winning writer of novels and short stories, a critic, a poet, a translator, and an education consultant who has been a professor and chairperson at the Center for English, JNU, New Delhi. He was visiting professor, fellow, research fellow at various universities all over the world, to name a few: University of Paris, University of Cyprus, University of Essex, University of Iowa, University of Newcastle, University of Hyderabad, University of Grenoble. Professor Prasad has, to his credit, more than 70 PhD supervisions and more than similar number of MPhils. He is the author of about 15 prominent books, book publications covering a diverse areas such as disability studies, translations, Indian English, Indian literature, post-colonial studies, and edited volumes on major English literature texts and authors taught across universities in the Indian subcontinent. He has published a collection of stories, a book of poems, and a novel besides academic works. He has been and is a member coordinator of prestigious international and national academic circles and bodies responsible for deciding the syllabus and the training programs for students and teachers of literature and advanced research projects. He is a regular contributor for Indian literature, post-colonial, translation studies in major encyclopedias and anthologies. Apart from these, he has well over 40 major published essays to his credit. Very impressive CV of Sir. We consider ourselves fortunate to have you, Sir, amongst us today. We are eagerly waiting for your delivery, Professor. Before I end my words, I would like to thank my colleagues in the Department of English, our IQAC coordinator, Dr. Aditya Saxena, and special thanks to teacher in charge, Shashwat Bhattacharya, for organizing the annual lecture and for all help to hold this event online. All my wishes. Thank you very much. Over to you, Shashwat.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal, for your kind words and such a nice introduction to Professor Prasad. Now I formally welcome you, sir, and this entire online portal is yours. We, your former students, current critics, and future translators, all of us are waiting to hear you. Yeah, so you.
Thank you, Principal Agarwal. Thank you, Shashwat. Thank you, Vandana. Thank you, Deshbandhu College, for inviting me to this talk, to put yourself to this and others to this torture of listening to me for the next 1 hour and being my captive audience, though this is a virtual audience, which means that it need not be captive. So I shall assume that you will stay on if the topic interests you. And if you have any, I know this is very formal usually, and this virtual talk actually creates issues for me because I like a certain level of informality. I like people to interrupt, to ask me questions, to kind of answer my questions when I'm talking, to be interactive, which I know will not be possible, but I hope many of you will at least write down your questions, anything that strikes you that you may ask through moderators or whatever later on. Right, when I was introduced, there were two things I want to quickly point out before you start thinking of this, a kind of genius or whatever, or a very hardworking person. When Dr. Agarwal introduced me, he was reading from my CV. It may be long enough. It's not as long as many others, that or many others, but it just shows my longevity, if you want, in academics. I've been teaching for about 40 years. I've done a lot of things because 40 years is a long time in an institution. So excuse me for the work I've done. I've just done it because I've been in JNU for that long. So the other thing is that Shashwat failed a question asked in not just farewells, but freshers welcomes, which is the expansion of my name. And people are asked, what is the full form for G.J.V. Prasad? And he confessed he doesn't know what the J stands for. The J, Gaurishankar is my father's name, which has become my first name because of the vagaries of the passport system. But Gaurishankar is my father's name. Jayalakshmi, J is my mother's name, Jayalakshmi. In the South Indian naming system, you take your father's name as your initial and then your name. You could earlier, and if you did come from a village or a town and your native place, you took that as your first initial and then your father's name. Since we're all Delhiites, our third generation Delhiite. And so I just decided, my father's name, that my father decided. There was no city name or village name or town name attached to our names. But later, when I was 13 or 14, I decided that I'm the son of both my parents. So I need both their names in front of as my initial. So I made my name GJ Venkateshwar Prasad, GJV Prasad. So Gauri Shankar Jayalakshmi. This is a process of this kind of changes that we make in terms of our identity. This kind of movements that we make in our life where we accommodate other thoughts, other ideas, and then other cultures and other languages in our lives. All this I see in terms of translation, right? That we are always in a process of translation. If you want to say, for the time being, are you using a different name for transformation? I would say perhaps, but because it's translation, not transformation. All translation is transformation, right? And then we'll talk about specific instance of translation and see what translation really does. Now, because I'm talking to an English department, and because we're talking about translation, because I'm talking to English department, I will give you the scientific, physics definition of translation, right? Translation is the movement of an object across space and time such that at the end of that movement, every molecule of that object remains in the same relationship to other molecules as they did in the beginning, right? So in effect, when my cell phone goes across space and time, I take it with me to my office, I take it with me to my friend's house, I'm taking it across the table here. At the end of that 1 minute, when it crosses the table, it's the same cell phone. Everything is the same about it. There's no change in any property. This is what Shashwat is saying people think happens in translation, literary translation. He said, we read a lot of Indian stories, Indian fiction from Indian languages, poetry from Indian languages in our Delhi University syllabus. We read them in English, but we don't think of them really as in terms of as translation. We think of them as reading the original, as reading those writers. You don't say we are reading these translators, we say we are reading these writers, right? So the literary commonsensical expectation of translation is the same as the physics definition, right? It's the same, that we think a text can go across language, a text can go across time. So something written in the early 20th century, translated in the 21st century, coming into a classroom in 2021, you expect that English text in 2021 to read like the Bengali text written in early 20th century. You think you're reading that Bengali writer in your English translation. And this is interesting because we look at two translations, let's say Home and the World, Ghare Bahre. If you look at two translations of that text, you'll end up reading two different English texts. They read differently from each other, right? Which is why the second translator translated it, because second translator was not happy with the first translation. And then you read a third translation. That's a different text altogether. So you tend to think when you compare translations, and if you know the language of the first text, the Bengali text, if you know Bengali and you read the text, you will start evaluating these translations in terms of how good a translation they are of the Bengali text. Of course, they can ask each other, what does good mean, etc., etc., but I'm not going to that at the moment. If you don't know Bengali, you read these three translations and you compare them to each other, you're all the time trying to approximate what the Bengali would have been because these three people have done it differently, right? So that is when you start realizing that you're not reading the Bengali text in these three translations. You're reading the three translators' interpretation of the Bengali text. The interpretations may change in terms of overall interpretation. They may change in terms of interpretations of certain passages, certain chapters, or even overall a thematic interpretation in the way it looks at what is being done in the novel. But yet, a lot of us look at translations, read translations, and we'll even comment about the language. We're not commenting about the language of Jivanananda Das. We're not commenting on the language of Tagore. We are commenting on the language of the translator. But that's not how we think of it. We think, oh, what wonderful use of imagery. Whose imagery? You don't know the Bengali, you don't know Tamil. Is that the imagery from the Tamil or the Bengali or the Telugu or the Kannada or the Gujarati? How many languages do you know? Right? You are talking about the imagery used by the translators of these various texts. And that it works well in English because you're reading it in English. So when we're talking about translation then, what we miss completely is the act of translation itself when we're discussing literary text in the classroom. We tend to think we are reading texts from different Indian languages. We're reading them in English, but we forget that that's what's happened. We are reading them in English. That's a mediation that's happened. There's a mediator who's intervened. And what has a mediator done? We have no idea. We don't, very often, we don't even look at or remember the name of the translator. This is not just in the literature classroom, it's overall. I'm saying this is commonsensical. This is what the common reader does. Have you read Marquez? Of course. What wonderful writer. Yes. And you're talking in terms of style and language. You're not talking theme. You're not talking narrative. You're not talking story. Even that can change sometimes in translation. And you're talking about Marquez and you're saying all this. Whereas you're talking about the translator. Very many of the things you're saying are about the translator. Right? So I was asked if I could speak about Indian literatures. That's it. There's no way I can speak about Indian literature or Indian literatures in the plural without talking about translation. And I must put together this translation and the plurality together to make it singular. How translation makes it not plural, but singular. What does that, what do I mean by that? We have so many languages in this country. All of them are rich and flourishing. Right? The ones which are going extinct are going extinct. That's a different matter. They may also have a very rich history. Right? They usually have. We don't know each other, many of the languages. We may know 2 or 3 languages. We don't know most languages in this country. And more, I find people just know 1 language. But that doesn't matter. It's not judgmental. I said this is how it is. That's how we are. Right? We can't read each other. We can't even talk to each other. There are so many different languages in this country. These languages have their own unique histories, and very often these are histories of conflict with other languages. You're Assamese because you're not Bengali. Various languages and peoples of the different states in Northeast India are what they are because they don't want to be Assamese. Forget what I'm saying. There's a conflict of languages. There are hegemonic languages, other languages split away. There are hostility to these hegemonic languages. So you can see how it happens, right? Bengali versus Odia, Bengali versus Assamese, Assamese versus other languages in the Northeast. So you can see all this happening. And when you think of various Indian languages in conflict, but also if you look at it carefully, they have there's also commonality of history in these various languages. There are words that come together. There are words that travel across languages, the way they influence each other. Let me just very quickly tell you something and then get back to my main point, which is that if you take the Naga conflict, the Naga movement, the Naga movement is an interesting movement to see. Because how did they get together? They got together. What is the language in common for all Nagas? Because all Nagas don't speak the same language. In fact, Nagas, as many tribes in different parts of the country, even in the same geographical area, may speak very different languages depending on when the different tribes came, when they settled, etc., etc., etc. Right? So what is the common language? What is the common language that they created? They created Nagamese, various Naga languages plus Assamese. the market language, the language they looked down on, the language they were in conflict with, was the very language that helped to unite them in their fight. Right? So there are very interesting instances that you can look around and see around this country where languages in conflict with each other also fuse together, also influence, also create historical moments of great importance, significance to various communities. In this kind of, and why I said about the hostility also to begin with, is to say, how are you going to say we have one literature in this country, Indian literature? Most South Indians listening to me, if there are, will understand immediately what I'm saying, is that when you're in North India and people talk about Indian, and most Easterners in this, if they're listening to me, will understand this. When you're North India and people talk about India, they mean North India, right? With the hegemony of Sanskrit and Hindi. They mean North India. So when they talk about Indian aesthetics, it's Sanskrit aesthetics. It's not Tamil aesthetics. It's not any other aesthetics, right? So there is this Indian business, and when they talk about one Indian literature, there is automatically a kind of resistance that one has to it to say, oh, one Indian literature from which point of view? Right? So there are various Indian literatures, there are various Indian languages, and they have unique histories. Tamil has a very long history. Right? When you talk about Panini and when you talk about Bharata's Natshastra, because that's interesting. I would sometimes say Bharata's Natshastra comes from the south of India, but that's a different story, right? So do you talk about Tolkappiyam at the same time? So there is a certain understanding now in academic circles that in English departments that we must try and accommodate as much as possible of this hugely different, varying, asymmetrical, if you wish, cultural, literary heritages of a country. We must accommodate as much as possible if you want to talk about India. But then how do you talk about one literature instead of Indian literatures? You're talking about one Indian literature because, as Sujit Mukherjee said a long time ago, it is in translation. It is in translation that because you're translating it to English, he said at that time, because he wanted to call this Indo-English literature, that is Indian literatures available in English language, Indo-English literature. He said, when they come into English, you tend to think of one Indian literature as possible, that Indian literature is a category, but in English translation. What he understood later on was there is an ideological construct here too, because what is this in English translation? What does this English translation attempt? What is it putting together? Unity and diversity. What do you understand by that unity? From which center? From which center, right? And for a long time, a number of translations existed. I think they still continue to do it. Translations into Hindi, for example. So why can't you find Indian literature in Hindi translation? Why can't you find Indian literature in Telugu translation? Why can't you find Indian literature in Bengali translation? You don't even think in those terms. Why? English and Hindi you think in terms of why? Again, because these are languages which you use to represent the nation. They're the official languages of India. And one, of course, has a past of trying to put together India for the British Empire. English. So you should be wary of languages and how they represent and take on the duty of representing and putting together a nation. Why, how, what, etc., etc. Right? Having said that, that's a larger question. The point is specific text. Okay, now I'm still talking about translation. I'm still on English, but I haven't come to Indian English. Right? Now, because I said translation, Indian English. Indian English is, of course, a strange animal, a strange beast. I don't know what the students who are listening to me think of Indian English. Do they think because they are Indians, we are Indians, and if when whatever English we speak, whatever English we write, it is Indian English? Do we have that kind of definition of Indian English? Or do we think it is a very clear in dialect, if you want, a variation, if you want, of English language? What do we think? What do we think? Is our English different in terms of grammar, in terms of spelling, in terms of structure, in terms of vocabulary? Is our English different from British English? The way American English is different from British English? Is Indian English different from British English? And obviously different from American English? Or do we tend, are we closer to British English and not as close to American English? What are we? What is the Indian English we have? And I tend to think that just like we may not have a literature, one literature, though we have contiguously, we have literatures that have, influenced literatures close to them, languages close to them, and then further down, because we are a huge country, we may have very many Indian Englishes, but we may not have one Indian English. And even those Indian Englishes have to be, the gatekeepers will not allow them. Let me put it like that. The gatekeepers of the English language will not even consider us our Indian Englishes. Why? And who are the gatekeepers? We are the gatekeepers too. Forget others. Right? If the students give you a paper which is full of grammatical deviation, which is sprinkled with words from Indian languages, which has structures which are different from standard British English, the teachers who are listening to me will circle them in red, cut marks, and tell them to learn to write better. So in effect, we too, as gatekeepers, as parts of English departments, do not accept variations. We do not accept Indian English. The Indian Englishes, if you want, that we accept from our writers, that we read with great delight and we talk about in classrooms and write in answers, are all right. But we ourselves cannot write like that and cannot speak like that if we are educated English speakers. But languages have a way of evolving. They don't care for what you say. Again and again, people will come up with, oh, come to the backside of the hotel. And you'll understand exactly what they're saying. And you will not laugh. Right? So there is a certain level of pressure on the English language that the English language you speak, the English language you write. It takes that pressure. We break the language, we push the language, and we use the language in a certain way. Regardless of what happens in the classroom, people accept that English, if it has to represent us and our realities, has perforce to change, has perforce to be changed. It has to be pollinated with Indian language terms, because English has no terms to represent our life. And therefore, our Indian English is always in translation. It's born of translation. It's a language of translation. It's a language in translation. You won't, talking to your friends, you won't say, my paternal elder uncle, my maternal my paternal younger uncle, my so-and-so aunt who's married to my paternal uncle. You don't want to use these terms. You're going to use the Indian language terms that you would use to talk about that relation in the region that you're living in. And the language that you're talking to your friends, that your friends will also know. Even when you're speaking English to them, the kinship terms you'll use are from the closest Indian language. English doesn't have the term. The English lacks the terms for this. So we will always push English in order to break English, bend English in order to express our reality. So this is Indian English, right? Always, there is no set Indian English. Indian English is always in creation, always happening, always being in translation, always in translation. And it is not as if there is an original out there that you're translating. No, you're speaking in English. You're speaking in English, right? And it is your brain has 2 languages, 3 languages in it. They're all mixed together. They're not in separate compartments. And you just pick up the word that expresses the idea the best, and you use it. So ठीक है, यही करते हैं हम. The language of region, the languages that are familiar to us, the words will come in. And sometimes we'll say, I can't get the word in Hindi, but in Bengali we say. You haven't got it in English either. You're speaking English, right? But you search for the most apt term in the language that provides it to you, and you'll give it and expect people to kind of try and understand it. Okay. I've already talked about Indian literatures. I'll come back to that again later on. But I've talked about translation and I talked about Indian English. Let me take, Shashwata, at some point you have to remind me of the time. It's just about when there were 5 minutes left, you must tell me, right? Okay.
The time is yours.
You can take any Indian English writer, for example, to illustrate what I'm saying. And I thought, I looked at the syllabus and you have R.K. Narayan, A Horse and Two Goats, the short story, right? That many of you must have read. Even if you're not, it's worth reading just to see if what I'm saying makes sense to you or not. Later on, that is. R.K. Narayan is a writer who may have lived in Mysore, but is from a Tamilian family and spent his formative years in Madras, now Chennai. So his language that, dominates in his world is Tamil. He writes about a Tamil world. So when he starts when he's writing in English, you will realize when you read him that it is a very, it is not like the English of any English writers. If you read Mulk Rajanand, if you read Raja Rao, of course, famously said this, I'll come to his quotation. If you read later writers as well, Rushdie, and you'll realize that some may actually be writing purposely in a certain kind of English, but some writers, their English is very different. R.K. Narayan's English is, of course, to us, a very old-fashioned English already, because who says sallied forth? Kind of English usage you don't find. So he's an earlier writer from an earlier generation. But also, his English is still odd, even if you say writer from an earlier generation. It has to be odd, because it is trying to express a Tamil world. And English does not have terms for this world. Also remember, when he was writing, and this is something that I must tell you, when you're writing in English, just like when you're translating into English, the difficulty for most translators and for most writers, if they think about it, is who is their audience and what will they know? What knowledge do they have? All right. So if you're writing in English in India or you're translating into English in India, who is your audience? What terms will they understand? Even kinship terms I was talking about, will they understand the kinship term that I'm using from Indian language because English does not have an equivalent? But will they understand a kinship term from a different language altogether, even in India? Will people understand the names of and the kinds of clothing that people wear? Will people just simply understand if I say she was wearing this? If it's very different from what they wear, the term is very different. What will they think it is? If I mention a food item, how do people understand? If I say, even if I say a word which I think has a North Indian origin of a Tamil sweet, let's say jangri. Will people understand jangri? Because I can't call it anything else even when I'm writing in English. I have to say jangri. Will people understand it? So will people understand names of dishes from Kashmir across the country? Will people understand names of dishes from Arunachal Pradesh across the country? Or Bengal or Assam or whatever, right? Would I not have to explain it? And if you explain it, then am I not giving, almost writing like an anthropologist? Does it not take away from my narration? Does my narration just not become an anthropological narration? Explaining India to you, this part of India to you. Do you understand this? That the English writer, as well as translator of Indian languages, has this peculiar, it's not so peculiar if you think about it, but has this problem that you're not sure your audience will understand your cultural references. Forget your literary references, your cultural world, the ecosystem. And then if you look at the history of that location, history of that language, history of the people, how will they understand? They're not going to catch those references at all. And if you're referring to other texts, they're not going to catch it. And writers in Indian languages are not writing to be translated. They're writing. So they don't care putting in as many references as they want. There'll be text full of, reference other texts and historical markers, which when you're translating, people won't know. And so if you're writing in English, originally in English, first in English, you're writing an English novel or English short story set in that area, set in that era, or set even in your contemporary times, but with those kind of references, what will your readership get? So you see now, when I'm talking in English and translation in terms of Indian literatures, they have a problem. There is something with that both of them demand of readers. Both demand this of readers, that readers pay attention, that readers be willing to do the research or simply try and read for the narrative and then look at these things later on. Readers need to work hard at this. You need working readers. People are willing to do some hard work. Publishers don't like this, by the way. Even Indian English writers who used to earlier have glossaries and all that, publishers don't like it. Publishers don't like glossaries, they don't like footnotes. So when you translate from an Indian language text, they like it to read like an English text. And if you're writing in English, they'd rather you not have glossaries. So one of the things is that the growing confidence, if you want, among Indian English writers is simply you can see it right from the beginning, the confidence in the reader, that the reader will work out, or really a demand of reader, kind of saying, look, when we read English text, don't they make various kinds of references? Very often the English novels that you read, study in your thing, but what people read will have reference to pop music, will have references to, food, of course. We never understand what food they're eating, to drinks, to dances, to operas, to all kinds of stuff. And to other languages. You'll have German language in English text, French language in English text. They don't try, you're supposed to just work it out for yourself. So why can't others work out what my English text is saying, what my English translation is trying to do? Let them work it out. So that's the attitude that one brings in. One of the things I tell translators, because Shashwat said, you talk about your experience as translator, one of the things you bring to translation, and I've been saying for decades to translators, is that try and write like Indian English writers, because they're translators as well. That's just as I told you, Indian English writers are translators. And if they're doing well in the market, right, So catch that moment. You write like, translate like them too, write like them. Don't try to become British because everything has to sound English. It doesn't need to. It can sound Indian English. Let people work things out, because they are doing that for Indian English writers. Sometimes not even understanding, but just going with the flow of the narrative. Right? How many people reading Rushdie in the West would have understood what chamcha means? Many would have gone through these texts without understanding a word of the other kinds of reference, right? It's okay. It doesn't matter. Not necessary completely. It adds a layer of understanding and appreciation to people who do, but doesn't take away from the pleasure of reading for others. These are minor irritants is what they will look at it as. Right. So our Indian English as a language is a language which is formed in translation. It's a language of translation. It's a language always in translation, as I said. Indian English writers are always translators, are always translators. Again, some of you may say, why? That's not true. That's not true. If you only talk about people, small group of people who live their entire lives in the English language. How many of us do? If as a writer, you want to talk about people, society around you, and most of us ourselves who are in the business of English, if you want, we don't live our lives all the time in the English language. We deal with a world which doesn't speak the English language. We deal, our daily life is and not even in the pandemic times, is when you go out, even if you speak in English all the time in your house, which I doubt, when you answer the doorbell, when you go out, when you buy stuff, it's done in various other languages. In fact, English may be the worst language to deal with certain circumstances. If you bargain in English, the price may go up rather than down. So it's things we decide when we switch codes, when we switch languages, when we mix languages. We are, dealing with a particular situation, negotiating, engaging with a particular situation to our best advantage. How do you do that just in English? So the English writer who tries to show this is showing us the act of translation all the time. She's performing the act of translation all the time. In fact, she'll show that translation is happening sometimes, because for you to understand that this is happening in a different language. Let's just take R.K. Narayan, who thought of himself as an English writer. R.K. Narayan, when he was asked very often, why did you write in English? As people are asked even now, why do you write in English? It's a very stupid question, but people are asked all the time. And it sounds stupid to most writers, as I said. But if you think about it, there is always something to that question. It comes from a certain point of view, an ideological point of view. It's to say, for example, that in India, English has a colonial past. So that is a question that you have to address. And I think every writer should address the question. You can give historical answers. You can say it's my first language, it's the only language I know. It's because of course, colonialism that's here, because of neocolonialism, because of globalization, whatever it is. But it's a language I'm most comfortable in. And so I write in the language I'm most comfortable in, etc., etc., etc. Whatever you give, you cannot dismiss that question. You have to engage with it. Narayan always said that he thought of himself as a novelist. And this is the curious bit. He thought a novel could be written only in English. I'm going to leave that out, because if I ever give a talk about Narayan, we'll go into that. Just to put it out there. So he thought of himself as an English writer, first and foremost. But he's talking about Tamil country, Tamil life. So when he's writing a short story, it's about characters, it's about events, it's about something. So how does he go about it? And interestingly, A Horse and Two Goats is about languages. It's about English. It's about Tamil. It's about two languages coming in negotiating, if you want, coming in conflict, if you want, with each other, dashing against each other, banging their heads against each other. The lack of communication, because the two characters don't understand each other's language. One is speaking Tamil, the other is speaking English, but all this is coming to you in English. All this is coming to you in English. R.K. Narayan's sense of humor, state of his smile at Americanisms, at American English, as well as the Tamil that he's talking about, the Tamil that the character is talking in, are coming to you in R.K. Narayan's brand of English. When you read the story, you are reading what I'm talking about, both Indian English as a language in translation, Indian English writing as a translated text, as also Indian literature, right, in translation, is something that you think about when you're reading this automatically, right? It starts off, the second line of the story is the name of the village, Cretam. And you may think, okay, name of the village. But names of villages usually have a meaning. And the meaning is given to you in the same very first paragraph of the short story, where he says it means the crown. All right. Now he has to tell you, means crown in Tamil. So he's signaling to you already that Tamil has to be translated into English for you to understand the nuances of the story, what's happening in the story, right? That in any case, he's talking about the Tamil life. So everything has to be translated into English for you to understand. So this story is coming to you in translation. He signals that very early. So it's not just because Tamil villager meets an American businessman. No. It's also because English is representing Tamil life. So you already have two languages, two cultures in engagement with each other. It's just translation. So R.K. Narayan signals that very early. Then, of course, he starts doing interesting things. Now, I'm just looking at the story here. In the second paragraph, that's what I want to see where it was. Right in the beginning, the second paragraph, Muni's wife cooks for him at dawn. He doesn't know how to say this. R.K. Narayan never knows how to talk about Tamil cooking, Tamil dishes. He doesn't, South Indian dishes. He doesn't know how to talk about them. See, we are talking about a writer who, when he began writing, the country didn't know North India, outside the South, the north of India, as most South Indians say, people didn't know idli, dosa, which is so common now. They didn't know idli or dosa. He couldn't say these things without people wouldn't understand them. They didn't know sambar, as far as he's concerned. Right? They didn't know toil. Most people still don't. And there are parts of India where you can go even now, and you won't find these South Indian dishes. Right? So, and in parts of North India, where you go, and you'll find dhabas or small restaurants announcing Indian and South Indian meals, Indian, South Indian, and Chinese meals available. Indian, default is North Indian, and then South Indian. So Indian, South Indian. So you're talking about, and that's now. I'm talking about this year, not maybe 2 years ago, before the pandemic that I went. So when you're talking about India, talking to fellow Indians, and in these days, especially even now, you can't be sure if they understand what are dishes if you give the name. So what does he say? Instead of saying she made a curry for him, or the English equivalent, she made a gruel for him, right? But he thinks gruel doesn't Doesn't sound right. But he doesn't want to say cool because nobody's going to understand cool. She threw some millet into boiling water. So he keeps describing the cooking process rather than naming the dish. And when he does name the dish, it's awful because he's trying to give an English name, right? So when he gets the drumsticks, which is of course Murangaka, Moringa as they call it in English now, which he didn't know at that time, which we didn't know that we could use. It's a wonder food now all over the world, Moringa, right? But at that time, we didn't know. I mean, even I didn't know till now, till a few years ago, that I could say Moringa in English. We'd say drumsticks, and most people would think, oh, chicken. And he said, no, vegetable drumsticks. Right. So he's got drumsticks in, and he wants to have drumsticks cooked how? In what dish? She says sauce. He says sauce. I want to eat drumsticks out of a sauce. What sauce? What is sauce? He goes horribly, horribly wrong when he tries to use an English word for it, as I said. Does he mean two things are possible, three things are possible, many things are possible? Completely tamarind-based, but since he talks about dal, I think it is not that. It is not the Vatta Konambir. It's not correct in that sense. It is either sambar. Either he's talking about sambar or he's talking about kut. Which one? In any case, how will no, the English term is better, they understand English term. Who understands this English term? If somebody tells you, I want to give you drumstick sauce, you won't even know what he's talking about. So in Arkanda, right, you see the translational problem that he's encountering and not solving too well. So this business starts in the second paragraph itself of the story. It's a lovely story. It's a beautiful story. You enjoy reading it. But you will see, if you actually pay attention to a language, you'll see everything that I'm saying. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole story. That you can do for yourself. But the interesting bit is that he has to tell you that Muni is speaking in Tamil. And then to ensure that you understand, that you don't, dismiss Muni, he also says he's speaking in chaste Tamil, that the village was known for, that the district was known for. And then he gives you a literary reference, which he thinks people understand, but I'm not too sure how he thought people would understand. But he just said, if I can say sage, poet, whatever, people get something. Avayar. It's a district where Avayar was born, he says. It's interesting that he is making these translatorial decisions. What will travel, what will not travel, how will it travel? And this is a hit or miss. As all translators know, you're not always correct, and you're not always sure how things actually finally travel. How much do people understand? So this Indian English writer, Arkanda Rai, one of the most well-known writers, most beloved writers, is struggling like any translator, right? Trying to translate across two different cultures, very different from each other. And I'm saying, people say, oh yeah, I know this is true. Indian languages and English are from two different families, two different kinds, very different from each other, etc. You'll struggle even going from one Indian language to not a contiguous language, a language further away. You'll struggle because different cultures, completely. So if you read your texts that you study in translation, your Indian literature texts, you will see the translator struggling in almost every text that you read. Most translations, in a sense, are, what can I say? I take for granted a certain majoritarian aspect, right? Hindu things will be understood. There's a Hindu majority and bias that most Hindus will bring to that translation. I'm not, and why not, right? Because most people would say, even though I sometimes use examples to show you cannot take anything, even this, for granted. Even this you cannot take for granted, but they bring that bias in. And they're wrong, therefore, because you can't take this for granted. We don't have one homogeneous Hindu cultural ethos around the country. We don't have. The references are different. They mean the way it works out in our lives, it takes on different shapes. No, right? But our climate systems are different, and you may, in the hotter areas of the country, you may say certain things which cannot be said in colder areas. For example, in English, somebody warms your heart. In many Indian languages, your heart cools. You live in a warm climate. If you live in a hot climate, your heart will cool, right? Whereas you write that in English, it works. How does that work? How does that work? Right? But as I said, it may not work too well. Many of the things may not work too well in translations in languages which are quite far apart geographically and culturally from each other in this country. So you will see translators struggle. If you pay attention to Indian English writers, you will see them also struggle as they're translating. You'll see Indian English writers struggle to show something happening in a different language. And they don't know how. Okay, A Suitable Boy has been in the series in the news again. If you read Suitable Boy, he will say at the end of a long speech, so-and-so said in Hindi, said in Urdu. Vikram Seth has to signal that you're reading this impeccable English, but it was not said in this language. It is not spoken in this language. The point of that whole clash is that different languages coming together. The languages of Zamindari versus the language opposing the Zamindari. He has to talk about different cultures coming clash with each other in different languages. Just putting it in English simplifies and takes away that nuance, takes away that play, the performance in language, deadens stuff, which is why when you read Indian literatures and English translation, or when you read Indian English writers, you have to give them a certain leeway, that certain things they cannot accomplish. There's a certain performativity that will be lost, which can be performed in Assamese, it can be performed in Mewari, it can be performed in Malayalam, but it may not be possible to perform in English. Because that kind of linguistic diversity cannot be brought in, or history cannot be brought into English. So when we're talking about Indian literatures, then, just as I said, when we're talking about Indian English literatures, we're talking about a very complex an area. When you put them all into one paper, when you read them in terms of being one, there is an ideology at work which is trying to put things together like a jigsaw puzzle, if you want, picking certain things up that work together, right? Having said that, I still want you to be careful. Like when Rajarao says in the thing, expressing in a language not one's own, the spirit that's one's own. But the spirit that's one's own what is that spirit? Unique to myself as an individual, unique to my linguistic and caste community. Does religion play a role? A Muslim in Tamil Nadu, a Christian in Tamil Nadu and a Hindu and different castes all have the same spirit. So what are we talking about? Expressing a spirit, that's and so on. So easily people have said India versus English, Indian spirit in English language. And I'm saying, no, 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 no. Don't let go of the complexity involved in this term Indian. It's lovely, it's beautiful. We are all Indians and good to be together. But we bring in so much to this, so many different trajectories to this term Indian. That's what makes it wonderful. And let's not let go of that. Let's not let go of that. Let's always look at what is being translated, how it's being translated, why it is being translated. If we ask these questions, our classrooms and our reading of Indian literatures will be much richer. And I'm including Indian English literature as well, will be much richer. Our understanding of the language you're working in will be nice, lovely, beautiful, complex. And happily we let other languages into our classroom, other languages speak in our classroom, and not be embarrassed by our pollinating English and, if you want, pollinating and, if you want, and getting in other languages into the English classroom and destroying the purity of the English classroom and English. I think I've taken nearly an hour, so I should stop because I can't think of why students should listen to more than an hour of this. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Prasad, so much for your enlightening talk. And you pointed out the key issues regarding the translation as an act and also as an area of critical inquiry, mostly the difficulties, and linking it up with the Indian literature in general and also the Indian English in particular. And the immediate thought that I have in mind is, in the past 50 minutes or an hour, what came up is the strangeness or the foreignness of Indian literature. Because the moment we read the canonical British English texts, we necessarily do not ask this kind of questions because we are under the pressure of the colonial rule and the culture. We are so much familiar to them that it's easier for us to understand the connotations of British culture than, let's say, the Tamil culture or let's say the Odia culture. Right? So it's time that we rethink about the way we approach literature in general and the approach to canon. Because if Indian literature canon or literature's canon is to be formed, it can be, as you said, there are potential possibilities that one can have them in translation in their own language, let's say in Tamil, in Odia, in Punjabi, in Bangla as well. And there is an overarching availability and accessibility through English as well. And the problem is what the nature of that English will take up is dependent upon two factors. One's the readership. Is it only the Indian readers or there are foreign readers? And also how the translators are trying to negotiate the process of transportation of the local culture into another language group, because language is a matter of cultural memory. As you said, you pinpointed, especially with Arkin example and his failure to talk about the food items and how the culture stops getting transmitted. Right? Because, yeah. So now the forum is open for questions. Kindly drop your questions in the chat box and would like to take them up. Yes. But your talk, as ever, sir, was thoroughly enjoyable. Yeah.
In any case, and people are thinking, I was just taking off from what you said, Shashwat, that we are colonized in the English departments in a certain way. It's changing, hopefully. But I remember my first visit to London And I crossed the road, turned left, and as I was turning, I said, "Oh, there should be a church here." And there it was. I was stunned. I was stunned. I knew the terrain of London. I could recognize streets and where to turn and what I would see when I'd never been there before. Right? And I couldn't do that in Mumbai. That's in Bombay. I couldn't go to Bombay and say this should be there at the end of the street. Right? And I couldn't do that even in Chennai. Right? And I was saying, forget Kolkata, forget places I've not been to. I'm talking about places I've been to in India. And I'm saying, as I came to this. So I was saying, how do I recognize this? How do I know my London so well? It's because all the English canonical texts that one read, all the Dickens, all the things. So I could actually also see the absences. What should have been there, but was not there any longer. And I was explaining this to my cousin who'd been born and brought up in London, who didn't know things like there was a workhouse here. How do you know this? He would ask me. How do you know there was a workhouse here? I said, because Dickens says so. So I brought other resonances, other understandings to places, to streets in London. And it shocked the hell out of me. And I said, I can't be like this. I have to open myself out. Right? It's one needs to know more about the whole of the world. Forget just going nativist. I need to know more of the world, but I also need to know more of the world, including my own country. Right? I need to know more.
And also, sir, our confidence about the so-called, as you pointed out, there are British Englishes, not one English. A typical incident I would like to narrate here is that when Tagore was translated, his Gora was translated, and we were reading it during our student days. And there was a particular passage where the translator is writing, who is also an eminent scholar of English language and literature. She is writing, and there he was asking for the tea things. Now, this expression tea things, fine, it sounded so not English for us. And then we debated a lot over that expression, that how this negotiation in expression came to being. And then later we discovered that Jane Austen also used that same expression for tea things. So our confidence in the so-called British language is also questionable.
Very.
Sometimes what we translate also may be so-called one kind of an English, fine, we are not aware about. And then again, the Indian languages, all kinds of Hindis, for instance, all kinds of which one is standard, we really do not know. Fine, and how do we bring about those flavors while translating? You gave that example of that word chamcha, for instance. Fine. Now, satanic verses. All right.
Exactly. That's a book.
Actually, how do we then all translation, is it then it's satanic verses? Fine. Because the case in favor of translation is one, that it makes a text available, whereas it would have been absent the translation. Apart from that, there's always a charge against translators that it was not adequate enough, it was not good enough. Fine, and there are mythologies which have been established over the years, right? Now, if this is the case, if everything is not so right about translation, because I know all my friends or Bengali speaking people, whoever will read any book, Bangla, in translation, they will say, oh, this is not a good translation. You won't understand this. Fine. So whenever you have an access to the original language, you never try and talk about the translation. But the whole of European literature flowed to us through translation. And we never registered a single complaint. Never. I mean, as once you said, I remember, what is so Russian about Russian literature, except for the names, right? Because it's read so English, right? So yeah, we need to also look at, as you pointed out, that how do we approach the very study of literature?
Exactly.
The whole of Plato, Aristotle, the whole theory that you are talking about, all of these are coming through us, through translation only. The whole of science is coming to us through translation. We generally do not talk about science disciplines and translations, right? But all of it is coming up. Anyway, so we have quite a few questions coming up. I'll read it out.
Yeah.
There's one long question by my colleague, Krishnan Unni. He says, do you agree with Tejashwini Niranjana's idea of transcreation replacing the stringent view of translation as Indian English in translation is concerned? If so, how do we solve the vernacular languages lagging behind? Perhaps the best, as transcreation sips in the cultural context of the translators, as many of them go for the judgment where the regressive is detected and denounced. It's a long question. I think I need a translation first. But yeah,
it's a wonderful
only
and it's a nice, lovely, complex question. It uses a term which comes to us in English, which translates the way we look at Indian languages. It uses the term vernacular, right? Now, I know there is a certain way of using the vernacular, which is to talk about native aesthetics, the aesthetics of, which are different from the mainstream, from the canonical, etc., etc. It has a term in place in architecture, etc. But in terms of otherwise, it seems to, any case, even then, give a certain kind of hierarchy, that there is something which is dominant and there is the vernacular. It therefore makes us look at Indian languages in terms of the hierarchy as lower than or different from the mainstream, if you want. One or two, which is not lower therefore, but whatever. But catching up all the time kind of stuff, right? It gives you that, because when it lags behind, automatically these terms come with the use of the term vernacular. Catching up, lagging behind. If we just simply see all these as different languages, yes, in relation to each other, many Indian languages are hegemonic over other Indian languages. Right? And they've had positions of power over other Indian languages. English still has a position of power, but depends on which particular field, how you're looking at it. In politics, for example, in terms of hurly-burly of elections, in terms of power in various Indian states, English may not play a role as much as the Indian languages do. Right? So the point I'm making, therefore, is to use the term vernacular sometimes may mislead us into thinking in a particular way, misdirect us into thinking in a particular way. If we think in terms of languages, all of them are Indian languages, including Indian English, then we can still talk about the power structure, we can still talk about power struggle, but we can also establish a certain kind of equality, right? And give respect to each language. This is not answering his question, because his question, I think, is a wonderful question. It comes from a certain thinking about languages, and which works very well for him. But I was saying, I'm trying to explain these terms to students who are listening in, right? How they can also think and think differently about this. In terms of, there's a new term being used, explaining to students again, transcreation. Now, the business about translation in India is very often in India, translation is, there is a conflict of definitions in terms of the English, what comes to us in English as translation and what comes to us in Indian language as translation. Now, I was not going to go into that, but if you want, very quickly, when you have, when in English we get translation, we're getting a European definition of translation, which is centered around the translation of the Bible, the Holy Word. So that is a question of being loyal, truthful in translation, because you're translating the central text of the religion, etc., etc. So this whole thing of how that book has to be conveyed exactly the way it is in translation. So there's a lot of theory that emanates from this position. In India, that is, even within the majoritarian Hindu thing, there is no central text and whose sanctity has to be maintained, etc., etc. In the Hindu majoritarian thing. So the translations that occur in India would, in terms of Western theory, be seen as rewritings rather than absolute translations, right? So you have, therefore, Ramayana attributed to Kamba Ramayana, where he actually dusted off his hat to Valmiki is seen as Kamban's Ramayana. Tulsi's Ramayana is Tulsi's Ramayana, right? So you give that the text to the writer in that language and say it is his or her Mahabharata or Ramayana or whatever. So this is seen as that there is no ownership, authority. There is no original and translation. If you want, there's a first text, the other text, and they're equally original to the translator as writer. This is also then seen as transcreation, right? Creating in a different language, rewriting, creating, transcreation. So this is another term that's coming up. It comes up also specifically in terms of India. It comes up because this is seen as how we've done translation. Because otherwise, in Tamil, there is a term, Moripayarpu, which means exactly what the Western translation means. To take across with force, by force. To migrate. These terms do come, meanings do come. And in that grammatical text Tolkappiyam, where the term Moripayarpu comes, interestingly, the grammarian also talks about first text and secondary text, primary and secondary, which is of course not seen as part of Indian tradition because this is Tamil. This is not Indian. I'm sorry, I have to take that swipe, but it's there in Tamil, right? And he says, what is secondary? And he says the person who thought it out first, who cogitated over it, who produced a text, that's primary text. Anybody who explains it, who abridges it, who translates it, who expands on it, all these texts are secondary. So translation there becomes a secondary act, not, as we say, another original text. It seems to be a secondary act. But one needs to do more research on what kind of text that is being talked about. My feeling is, of course, the translation that is being referred to is like a glossing, because scholarship was always bilingual. So if you know two languages very well, then what happens is that your scholars, not everybody does, reads. I'm saying people may know languages, but to read Sanskrit and Tamil, then what you need, let's for example, is a word by word glossing, so that that is translation. It's not, doesn't read like a proper text, but if I want to know what a particular word there, I got a meaning. So is that what he means by translation? I have no idea. I just guess. I assume that's what the text is saying, right? So I've not, without answering the question, which I cannot, because it sounded too complex to me. I'm trying to open up the terms to see where one can go with this for others to think about, to discuss. I'm sorry I didn't do justice to the question, but.
Thank you, sir, for relating this act of translation to the whole discourse of nationalism. Because as one of your former colleague said, that in order to be Indian, and that's the problem of whole Indian English and translation, one has to be South Indian first. Fine. So when you said I'm Tamil and not Indian enough, that's because you are Tamil, that you are Indian, isn't it? Fine. I think when he was trying to hint towards that when he said vernacular languages and transcreation, the amount of liberty one can take to accommodate the greater discourse within that small discourse of representation. So we have a student, Shifa
Fatima. Again for that, just one second, one more thing. What is also being talked about, and I've talked about it earlier, is that what is an acceptable Indian English in writing, acceptable across the country? It's acceptable if your English is pollinated by Hindi to a large extent. That is seen as acceptable across the country. If you pollinate your English with a lot of words from, languages from Northeast, if you want, various languages, so many rich languages. if you pollinate the language from the English from the birds from Telugu or Tamil or Malayalam or Gujarati, it is not as acceptable because that is seen as not understandable across the country, whereas Hindi is seen as, right? And you can see this even in R.K. Narayan's writings. In his days, he would say dhoti. He will not be saying veti or veshti, which will be, of course, mark the caste in Tamil, but he doesn't use that. He says dhoti because that Hindi term, according to him, is available across the languages, even though dhoti is thought of as worn differently in different parts of the country. Right? So it is still even now difficult to take a certain local term and make it part of Indian English and accept intelligibility or acceptability, more than acceptability across the country, and majorly by the gatekeepers, if you want, the critics. Yeah, thank you. Carry on.
So that acceptability is also a production of the politics of representation and how you form that canon, right? Because, there's a student with us, Shifa Fatima. She is in second year. She has a question for you. Our languages are framed to express our realities the best. Even after realizing this fact, we are hesitant to use the means which represent us the best. We tend to move away from our comfort zone, like we use English, which constantly needs to be twisted and pushed to bring out the meaning of the message as we are willing to convey. Sir, do you think it is a compromise, or can we call it as a drawback of translation?
See, there are a couple of related questions within that question, really speaking, right? And question of, for me, the most important thing in this kind of questions is also what is understood, accepted, and not stated, which is location. Where are you located, right? So when you ask this question, that language that I'm most comfortable in, are you located in a context where that language can be used in every situation and will be understood by everybody, right? And is the language, and are you in a situation where that language that you're speaking, that you feel most comfortable in, is a language that is used within that, what can I say, academic sphere or cultural sphere, right, where you are located. I may be most comfortable in Tamil, but I'm in Delhi. Will Tamil suffice for me? Okay, I'm most comfortable in Tamil, but I teach English. I'm in an English classroom. How much Tamil can I use? You get the point I'm making. So this is where, depending on where you are, you need to speak a different language, to learn to translate, and to be because you're already in translation. You are in translation. You are in a translated position, right? That's one thing. The other thing I've realized over the years, I used to think in terms of distinct location, but you may be in Chennai, you may be in Madurai, I'm just in Tamil Nadu, you may be in Kanyakumari, you're in different locations. And the pressures on your Tamil are different. On your Tamil, language you're comfortable in, you may be next to a Kerala border, the pressure on your Tamil is different from if you're elsewhere. In Vellore, for example, in Vellore, with the pressure of Urdu and Tamil language is very high, right? So the Tamil you speak in these different locations in Tanjavur or Kumbakonam, wherever, the Tamil you speak in these different locations, Tamil Nadu, are born of different kinds of linguistic pressures, right? And therefore are very different from each other. Are quite different in terms of vocabulary, in terms of even tonally. Sometimes they're very different. You can hear people and say where they are from, right? So it's not as if a pure language. When you say a language, I'm most comfortable with this. You're most comfortable in the language available to you for a large part of your life in a particular location. You shift location within the same linguistic area, you may not be as comfortable. So these are things that one also has to keep in mind when we talk about language and language in India, right? In any language, right? Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have a postgraduate student, and he has a question, and his question is a little longer, but I'll read it. Do you agree that while there is complexity and diversity in Indian literatures, there is a particular caste context that is all pervasive in Indian literatures, and especially Indian English literature has largely upper caste consciousness inhabited in writers like Raja Rao, Bhavani Bhattacharya, R.K. Narayan, etc. Can caste be seen as binding factor in Indian literatures?
I used to define India in these terms. I would say you're Indian if you practice caste. If that is those parts of India or those peoples in India who have no caste consciousness are perverse, not Indian. Not Indian. It's not depend. Religion has no role to play in this. You can be Christian and practice caste and be in part of the caste structure. You can be Muslim. You can be Sikh. You should not be. I'm not talking about should not be. I'm talking about reality, right? As it is. So if you are not, then as once Giv Patel writing about India, being Giv Patel, he says, the problem is that you're not, if you're not Hindu or Muslim in India, you're not even part of the hate. So you left out of the majority, the major thing that makes people Indian is that hatred, which puts you together, he says, right? So in a sense, as I said, okay, to be Indian is to be aware of caste and the way caste plays a role in our lives. Having said that, caste plays its way into culture, society in different ways in different parts of the country. The caste as practiced in Bengal is not the same way caste was practiced in Kerala, for example. Right? So you will find that this too is complex. That's the point I'm making. This too is complex. This too is not a simple thing of upper caste and others. Like you already have OBCs, for example, right? In a political structure. You will look around and you will find that some of the most violent conflicts in contemporary India have been between what are considered to be, what are in government or in legal thing called OBCs and the Dalits. It's been completely violent. When you read Raja Rao, for example, you'll notice something. If you read Kantapura, you don't read Kantapura, right? Do you? So otherwise I'll say that the caste structure there will surprise you when you read Kantapura, right? It's upper caste, of course. It's an upper caste novel, completely. It's an upper caste narrator, completely. But the caste structure will still surprise you. If you're a North Indian, right? So if you go around the country, you'll find things work themselves out differently in different regions. So whether in translation or in Indian English, right? If you want to homogenize, if you try to homogenize this, you'll have a problem. But if you're willing to think in complex terms, then yes, caste will always play a role. You can see the caste position of the writer. You can see what happens in terms of caste in the fiction. Yes, of course. You may have to read against the grain sometimes, but yes, of course. That's what is reading all about, right? That's what is reading. You'll find it everywhere, right? Everywhere? No. You may not find it, for example, in in quite a few writers, in major Indian English writers from Northeast India, for example. Will you find caste in work there? You may not. You will not. You will not. Of course, I laugh, saying, oh, it proves that they're not in that contention, that they're not Indian. But if you're willing to go with this idea that India is a complex country, and Indian literatures are expressions of this complexity, and when we read them for this richness. Yes, of course. Okay.
Thank you, sir. So we have a question from a professor of history of our college, Dr. Shailendra Jha. Words of Sanskrit mantras have phonetical dhvani. Importance, if it is translated, then phonetical effect of that Sanskrit word disappears. That is why Sanskrit mantra is not translated. Sir, your opinion?
It's very, holy texts, if you want, are extremely difficult to translate. They come with a worldview, which and this is coming a kind of approach, an understanding of the world in one language is being transported to another language, which is a completely different understanding of the world. Right? So how do you do it? How do you do it? Right? And therefore, this is why you see, when you see any Sanskrit text, for example, of religious texts, if you want, any of those, even Yoga Sutra, if you want, translated into English, you will find that the translation may be of 3 lines, the footnotes will be 25 lines. Because you have to explain everything again and again and again, hopefully with all this trying to approximate, get the person to the meaning of the word. Yes, of course. The whole thing about whether you can get the sound across, because the Vedas have to be pronounced, said in a particular way, etc., that's almost impossible, right? Which is why even the Quran cannot be translated, because it has to be, it is a tone, it's a language, it's the way it is said. Which is why also most holy texts cannot be translated, because it is in the expression, the sound, the word, that the mystery lies. And the mystery cannot go into a different language without losing that mystery, without losing that holiness, the spiritual content, right? Which is why I said it's difficult. When you start talking in those terms, right? So what is translation then? Translation then is explanation. So when we translate Sanskrit text or the Quran or the Bible, in a sense, you are explaining, you're retelling, you're explaining. They cannot be seen as standing for the original text shoulder to shoulder. That is, you can read one or the other. No, you're reading the other as an explanation of the first. I don't think I can add to this.
Right. I had little curiosity, because the way Indian literature, any literature for that matter, is promoted is also a matter of the economy of awards, right? And when it comes to a writer, rarely we promote a translated text as in contest with a text written in first language. Let's say someone is translating a text in English, someone is translating a text in English, and both of them are judged for a contest. Recently, this JCB group, they have announced a literary award. I think they have allowed the translated text also to contest with a text which is written in English, which is a good move, because then the translator, they get the encouragement, because translators are never ever acknowledged for the labor that they have put in. Their names will always appear at least 10 times smaller fonts than the original authors, And in most cases, their names won't even appear on the front page. Fine. As if to be a translator is just an anonymous job. Fine. As if it's just a responsibility done. And the text is traveling in the name of the author, whereas the translator is literally rewriting the text, as you said, word by word, move by move. So how do we negotiate this hierarchy between the translator? How do we encourage translators? Right.
See, that's why I said we come from, in India, we have ways of talking about translators as the people who own the translated text. If you look at all the epics translated to various Indian languages, they always attribute the text in that language to the writer in that language. So you don't say Valmiki Ramayana as translated by Kamban. You say Kamban's Ramayana. You say Tulsi's Ramayana. It's the same thing with Mahabharata, whatever. So there is a way of attributing it to, and I'm putting this in quotation marks, the translator. Right. Will that happen now? I don't think so. I don't think so. Except again with Ramayana, you can still do it, I guess, because there's a tradition. But I don't think, like if I translate Ambe into English, it is Ambe's story still. It will not be seen as Prasad. So what we would like to see is at least understand that this has come into the language because of the translator, and that what you're reading is the translator's language. That's what I want to emphasize. You're reading the translator's language and the translator's interpretation of the other text. So if you have two different translations, they will read very differently of the same text. So as publishers, I would think they would like to give equal status to the translator, right? Yes, this is Ambai, but it is also Prasad's translation, right? Yes, it is Ambai, but it's also Lakshmi Holmstrom's translation. And I would like to think, in my head at least, that Lakshmi Holmstrom will be better than Prasad, right? Because I have great respect for Lakshmi Holmstrom. So I would think she would do a far better job than I do, right? So do readers think so too? To others, I'm also a reader. It's a reader, I think so. But do others think so too? This consciousness of reading text and translations as something done by the translators, and not to blame the writer of the text in the other language, the first language, not to blame that person for the blemishes of the translator also, of the translation, right? Not to say Tagore is such a bad writer, overrated writer, because I read Tagore in English translation and doesn't work. Doesn't work in English translation among the few translators read, because he does work in certain English translations. So are you blaming the translator? Or are you saying Tagore wasn't a good writer? You get what I'm trying to say? You have to make the distinction. You have to make the distinction. You have to understand you're reading a translator, right? And once you get that into the classroom, once you get that into public discourse, once you get that to reviews, you would have automatically done the translator a service, and you'd have also done the writer of the first text a service, because very often they are misread because people are reading the translation. Right? And yes, when you're talking about Indian English literature, to talk about translations in the same breath, even in prizes, is a good thing, because Indian English literature, as I said, is a literature in translation.
Yes. The whole canon is a production of translation. But as you said, that we are reading writer and we are assigning text to writers, that's how we know them. But when, let's say, we read or talk about Plato, we always talk about whose translation, whose definition of tragedy. Time. Is it this translator or that translator? Because the definition also changes, right? So yeah, we have one or two questions coming up. I'll read two of them together. One by Dr. Ajanta Dutt and the other by Dr. Priti Gupta Diwan. First one, isn't it important to maintain the structure and rhythm scheme of a poem when recomposing it in translation? For instance, in Tagore's poetry. That's one. And the second is, we inevitably talk of loss in translation, it is more productive to think of how translation performs an invaluable service in making heard voices, marginalized literature, Dalit literature, for example. I think Priti is that a question or is that a remark? I think this is what we discussed partially, sir, before this, that how translation represents some of the texts which were never talked about. But Ajanta scheme is question is more or less like, how do we maintain the structural continuity? Right,
See,
while you do.
problem with it's a problem with poetry, of course. It's a problem with translating drama as well, plays as well, right? How in plays it's a question of in dialogues, right? How do you keep that spoken rhythm? How do you, what are you actually translating for? In terms of novels as well, you're translating, you'll realize when people speak in different registers, different kind of dialects, different dialects. How do you get that across into English? These are specific problems with all translation. How do you do this? When you're translating poetry, what are your isn't poetry the language itself, in the language, in the rhythm of the language, in the form that is used? Isn't that what you read a poem for? So can you act? So very often as translators, you re-perform. You may not be able to approximate the rhythm of the earlier poem, but you perform to kind of give a certain kind of resonance of the earlier, right? That obviously, if I use the same rhythm of Hindi or Tamil in English, it may not sound good. It may not work well. It may not, right? Depending on what I'm how capable I am. It also depends on what kind of rhythm I'm trying to get through into a different language altogether. But if I perform something, if I write a poem which performs what the other poem does in the other language, right? I think more or less if I can do it, I'd be really happy. I would think I succeeded. If I can actually, sometimes you translate for the form, and that's also a performance because you can't get everything, but you can, for example, if you think about the most famous Bengali poet translator, 9th century, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, who got across a sonnet and blank verse into Bengali. You can see what he was doing, right? But obviously he had to make it sound good in Bengali for Bengalis to actually then appreciate and make it their own, right? So just like this, when the sonnet entered English, it had to enter English, right? So this is something that translating poetry, you have to be clear as to why you're translating, what are you translating. Sometimes if it's just, a certain kind of corpus of work, a kind of series of poems that somebody's written about class, about gender, there's a different way you think of translating. But if it's you see it so much in the rhythm, so much in the structure, then there's something else you do. In terms of how translation is empowering a political, it's always a political act. Just like writing is political, translation is political. Why do you translate? As I said, why are you translating? What are you translating? How are you translating? This is the question I was ending with, right? I ended with. That these are important things to think about. And if you're translating, for example, let's say Dalit voices from around the country, that's an ideological project. You are giving space sometimes, and that's an interesting bit that one has to talk about. By translating the English, you make visible not just across, you make visible in the original language itself, the language of the first text itself, that particular text. Because you selected for translation, because it is traveled, people will read that text in the first language itself because they've not paid attention to it till it was picked up by you and translated and had a certain reception. Remember, all of us still have this cringe. If something is accepted in the West, we pay more attention to it. So if you translated English and you win an award, or you published, or you great reviews, or it's prescribed in various courses abroad, then people will read the first text to see what is so good about this. Why has this been translated? Why has it traveled like this? And then attribute motives to it. Of course you can, because I said all this is motivated. It's part of your ideological work too, your political work to translate. I think again, I should leave it there because nothing can be closed in this.
Yes. It's a curious example, sir, that you gave of Michael Madhusudan Dutt, because he was introducing a form which did not exist in that language.
Exactly.
Now, if we are translating, let's say she was asking about Tagore in translation, in the end, the question is, does it become an English poem or it remains a Bengali poem in English? What is the lasting impression? Because when sonnet comes to the Bengali language, post Madhusudan, that is post the later half of 19th century, poets after poets, they have tried to write in that form so much that today nobody in at least Bengali literature considers that to be a foreign form, right? So now the question is, who is the translator? Is it because Madhusudan Dutt, however he was importing a form which was foreign to the language, himself was a local? Was there a greater possibility of the acceptance? I mean, if we are introducing a newer rhyming scheme or a newer method of arrangement of lines in an English poem, will that be accepted as an English poem, or will that be accepted as an English poem written by someone who is not from that language?
See, we've had this experiment ongoing for quite a few decades with the ghazal in English. Right. So the ghazal is a form new to English, and people, major poets, have tried their hand at it. All right. Is it simply a curiosity, or is it a form that can work in English, that works in English? When people start, do people write, when they think of writing different forms, do they also think of writing a ghazal? Has it become theirs? Has it become a language, a form in English? One can't say till some time goes and it gets established, and more people simply think of it as one more form to use when you're writing in English. Right. It's happened with the sonnet in Bengali, which is why I chose it as an example. Right. It's happened to the sonnet in English because it's not an original English form. Right. So it's interesting that certain forms travel and travel well. Obviously, the reputation of the writer who's writing in that form, who's translating the form, taking that form in, the reputation of the writer makes a difference. Because after all, finally, it's acceptance among readership of that form that will ensure that the form continues to be used.
I think the success story of haiku here can be an example, sir.
Exactly.
It's a great success story.
Exactly.
So yes, do you have more questions? Yes, it was wonderful, sir, discussing with you literature and translation and Indian English. And we are here at Deshbandhu College looking for more, and we definitely want you to be here with amongst us with our students, introducing them to the other aspects of literature, translation, and post-colonial studies, or whichever area you want to. Right. So with these words, I would like to thank you, and I would like to thank each and everyone, my students, my colleagues, as they have joined and been with us for this entire talk. We'll come up with another talk very soon, so stay tuned with us. Thank you, all of you, and good evening.
Thank you.